Hafadetes and Manana Seeds, thank you for being here today. The Guam Trademark Commission will now be called to order. For the record, in accordance with the Open Government Law, meeting notices were given to all commission senatorial members, stakeholders, and all main media broadcast outlets. The first notice was on Wednesday, November 13, 2019, and the second notice was on Tuesday, November 19, 2019. Today is Thursday, November 21, 2019, and the time is 8:37. We have 7 members present, which represents a quorum. Sejus Maasi for attending this morning's meeting. We're keeping up our very good track record of making quorum every time and having very good attendance. So if we could go around the table for those listening in or watching in, just to remind them or introduce them to who we all are. So I am the chair of this commission for the Guam Trademark Commission, Senator Kelly Marsh Taitano. And if I can go to my left and have us go around.
Manana Sidus, Anne-Marie Arceo, Departamento Nkao Gunan Zamoro.
Laura Sauder, and I represent the speaker.
Albert Perez at the Department of Revenue and Taxation.
Mike Gunchuk with the Department of Revenue and Taxation.
Matthew Baza, the Guam Economic Development Authority.
Chris Lizama, the Guam Visitors Bureau.
Sejus Maasi, for your introductions and your presence. Today's meeting is the Commission's 6th meeting, and the Commission last met on Wednesday, October 23rd, 2019. Recapping last month's meeting, we had Mr. Matthew Baza of GITA and myself provide a presentation on intellectual property rights and the Guam product seal, following what we had given at the 4th Mariana History Conference. Today, we will have Dr. Laura Sauder provide us her presentation that she gave at that same conference. We will also have Mr. Mike Unsiog, is that how you pronounce it? Mr. Mike Unsiog, he will provide some of the overview of the processes at the Department of Revenue and Taxation when applicants file their trademark and copyright requests on Guam. So as we've been discussing all along, these discussions are useful as they provide informed and meaningful direction for the Commission to move forward in creating the framework and the scope necessary in drafting 2 different end products, one being the Guam Cultural Trademark Act, and the second being the Guam Trademark and Intellectual Property Rights Act. Later on, when we've moved through our agenda items, I think the best direction to get us ready for the next meeting is to determine which of those 2 we would like to tackle first. And that will help us inform us as to, at our next meeting, having that discussion about our working subcommittees. Let's move on the agenda to item 2A, new business. Oops, wait, am I reading ahead of myself? 2A. Let me just make sure. Yes, new business. So the presentation workshop. Overview of the intellectual property rights as presented at the 4th Marianas History Conference by panel member and commission member Dr. Laura Sauder. Yes, so we should be putting up the PowerPoint presentation, and then each of us has a handout of the presentation. There it is.
Manana Sidus Tatlo Todo Hamzo. When Senator Dr. Marsh Kelly and I and Matt presented at the at the Fourth Marianas History Conference, we were quite surprised at the level of interest and enthusiasm from the conference goers about the issue of trademark and the issue of how we're going to handle intellectual property, particularly indigenous intellectual property, intangible intellectual property. So that's a good thing because the community, artists, scholars, and the public are quite interested in this area that we've been given the responsibility to oversee. If I could have the next slide. One of the things that we did was to go over the responsibilities of the commission so that the people could know exactly what we were charged with. And we've identified several major areas of responsibility. The first is relative to protecting and preserving Chamorro culture, knowledge, and sacred symbols. So our charge, not explicitly rather than implicitly, gives us the responsibility to address issues related to the preserving of Chamorro culture, knowledge, and sacred symbols, and I think that that's important. This is not a generic exploration, it's a very specific and culturally relevant exploration. The other is protecting indigenous forms of artistic expression and what that might mean in the context of the Chamorro culture. Our indigeneity is beginning to be expressed in multiple ways, and we've now known from the experience of other indigenous peoples around the world that if we're not careful, we can lose the tremendous value inherent in our cultural knowledge, in our traditional knowledge, particularly in areas like sacred sites. And we all know that that's a very contentious issue in relation to development and military buildup. We also know that Amut, and the knowledge hidden in Amut is a very precious form of knowledge and is not easily protected. And the experience of other indigenous groups validate the fact that we have to be vigilant and careful about how we proceed. Could I have the next slide? I looked into all of the statutes that I thought might be relevant to Guam. Since we are a U.S. territory, we fall under U.S. policy rather than necessarily under world policy, global policy, UN policy. So I looked at the federal statutes related to indigenous intellectual property rights in the United States. And the single most important piece of legislation is called the Lanham Act and Native American Tribal Insignia Database. That is the federal trademark statute, which protects goods and services used in trade and to prevent consumer deception in the marketplace. Now, this act, it is quite complex, and one can argue whether or not we're classified under native rights in the U.S., but it is an area that we can explore. The Indian Arts and Crafts Act. Can we have the other slide? The next slide, please. The Indian Arts and Crafts Act authorizes a federally recognized Indian tribe to bring an action against a person who directly or indirectly offers or displays for sale or sells a good in a manner that falsely suggests it as Indian produced. So this is another act that exists in the federal structure, and it does have limitations because it specifically says a federally recognized Indian tribe. But we can look at this statute and see what it yields in terms of benefits for Guam. But this protects product that is made by Native Americans from being copied or from being deceptively promoted if it is not made by Native Americans. So it speaks to authenticity of art products. The next slide. The Alaska Silver Hand Program is something that the Native population of Alaska has generated, and it's a state trademark program which uses identification seals to certify authentic Alaskan Native art, similar to what Aotearoa, what New Zealand did with their seal. And this is an authenticating seal, so in our context, it would mean that something was produced by Chamorros as a Chamorro manifestation or expression of art. The Alaskan Silver Hand Program is only available to Native Alaskans who are part of a federally or state-recognized village or tribe and living within the state of Alaska. So this is something that, because it is state-generated, we might consider looking into more explicitly for Guam. The program issues a 2-year permit for the use of the identification seal, and the permit can be renewed indefinitely. To use this model, Chamorro people would have to be federally recognized as having tribal or village status as Native Americans. And so that would be if we were to use this specific statute, but a territorial statute could be comparable. The next slide, please. The Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which is also known as OHA, commissioned a study entitled the Native Hawaiian Cultural Trademark Study, which found that most Native Hawaiian artists favored the use of a cultural trademark program to protect against misappropriation and to provide recognition of Native Hawaiian cultural arts. Again, this is a recommendation that found its way into their policy that authenticates art as legitimate indigenous art. OHA concluded that the best approach is through the use of a cultural trademark. So how can people know whether something is authentically made by Chamorros? There would be a comparable Chamorro trademark. The next slide, please. SPC, or what we used to know as SPC, the South Pacific Commission, I think it's renamed, also published guidelines in 2002, and several members of our commission have shared some of the yieldings of that guideline, particularly Master Rabon, when he shared with us his familiarity with those guidelines to assist Pacific Island nations and territories seeking to establish legal protection for traditional cultural expressions. So TCEs are one of the common ways that the global community refers to traditional cultural expressions, and those include the full range of expressions, both traditional, specifically indigenous, and artistic that could mean modern art as well. The next slide, please. When we began our work here as a commission, we viewed the video on the Toi'iho, and that was very inspirational across the Pacific and across the world, really, in terms of conceptualizing and operationalizing what a cultural trademark might look like. So the Maoris created that trademark, the Toi'iho, which has become a model for many countries seeking indigenous intellectual property protection. It has of late, I think we need to disclose this, it has of late met some difficulty in terms of its continued use because of opposition from non-Maori artists. So we need to consider that the Trademark Commission has a responsibility to protect all forms of art, and specifically indigenous forms. I ended my presentation by talking about the kinds of issues we as a commission need to address in our deliberations. So could we have the next slide, please? We must address the following considerations. Chamorro trademark, for whom? Who would benefit? What would the purpose, the audience purpose be? How do we prevent the misappropriation of cultural symbols? This is already an issue, a challenge that we face in our community. I know that we all recall how the lati is sometimes misappropriated. It's a sacred symbol for Chamorros. People who are unaware of its sacredness can commercialize it, can use it inappropriately, and therefore bring harm to the sacredness of the symbol itself. So we need to address the issue of misappropriation of cultural symbols. And, you know, the worldwide case was Lilo and Stitch, and the controversies and litigation that occurred around that film that Disney produced. So that made us conscious that this is a very, a very difficult area to deal with, but has to be dealt with. And when it's dealt with in law, then it helps people, it guides people accordingly. How do we define intangible properties? Knowledge is not something you can touch or feel, right? Or certainly feel. You can feel knowledge, but you can't touch it, you can't necessarily see it. It's not a painting, it's not a sculpture. And so how do we define intangible knowledge? Because when we talk about the indigenous arts, we're talking mostly in the intangible realm. So we need to define that clearly. How do we protect sacred properties? Who owns sacred property? I mean, the commodification of land has confused the idea of ownership of the sacred. And so can Chamorros own the sacredness of land that someone else pays the real estate taxes for? That kind of thing. How do we resolve the potential conflict between collective versus individual rights? Many Chamorro artists feel that what they produce is theirs. They can make money out of it, it's their livelihood, and yet when they draw from cultural practice and traditional practice, is there a conflict? Maybe not, but we have to clarify that. And then when we talk about the collective, there are words that the Comisión de Finanzas Chamorro is often faced with, words like local are laden with confusion. Words like Guamanian, island resident, Taitano Guam versus Taitano. Those are clarifications that I think we have the responsibility to codify. And then what constitutes traditional cultural knowledge? How do we know that this is traditional cultural knowledge? Someone might come up with a recipe for an ingwenti, an omelet, that is new. Is that traditional cultural knowledge? Yes, when it draws from traditional knowledge of plants and their properties and so on and so forth. So and in the arts itself. So we need to clarify that. Who owns such knowledge? Do we own it collectively as indigenous people? Do individuals who are the holders and the bearers of cultural knowledge, do they own it? Those questions have to be clarified. Does the practitioner own it? Does the expert or indigenous people as a whole own it? These are some of the sticky questions that lead to litigation. And if we can clarify these questions, address them and clarify them as a commission, then I think we'll be providing a really important service to the public. And that literally ended the presentation with asking questions, and then a lot of the audience also raised many questions regarding the sacred properties, intangible properties, intellectual properties. Thank you.
Sujus Masi for the very good presentation, the excellent presentation. It's obvious that you did a lot of looking around and research, And this is really important. We fit in a lot of realms. We're part of the Pacific. There are indigenous peoples here. So we fit in those realms. We fit within the U.S. Within the U.S., there are indigenous peoples. So there are many areas for us to be looking at and be considering as potential models. It was very important you mentioning that it's not easy to protect and preserve basically anything that we're tackling. So we have a lot to think about as we move forward. And I really appreciated your mentioning the state statutes like the one in Alaska. And it does seem to tackle some of those issues that we've all been mentioning, and you mentioned this morning, where for the indigenous Chamorros that are here, they are part of this larger group of indigenous Chamorros. We have indigenous Chamorros in the Northern Mariana Islands. We have more indigenous Chamorros in the United States right now, the mainland and the states themselves. And then we have countless indigenous Chamorros living in places everywhere from Panama to Germany to Austria to Japan. And so I think us spending some time looking at statutes like that where they've had to tackle some of those issues will be very helpful. So the latest that I've heard, SBC has gone through several names. And so I heard from somebody who was just there for a conference, and they are now this is secondhand information, I have not double-checked it myself, but they are now referring to themselves as PC, Pacific Community, dropping the more colonial moniker, if you will, of South Sea, South Pacific, because really, right, we are the Pacific altogether. And then all of the questions that you were mentioning are really important, and they are topics that we discuss quite regularly. What are the definitions of local Guamanian island residents, resident Taitao Guam, and all of that? So thank you so much for a good overview. Did anybody have any questions or comments before we move on to our next presentation or discussion?
May I? The presentation really moves me because I'm in the middle of a situation, and I'm glad that, because I feel like I need support and help in defining these areas and exactly these questions posed at the end, because I'm facing that with both, museum and at the Chamorro Village, but most especially at the Chamorro Village, and trying to define what everybody's interpretation is of local, and trying to protect our own, at the same time being sensitive to that we live among other islanders and other peoples, and to be accommodating to that so we live harmoniously, right, is the greatest challenge for me right now, because I have a fiduciary responsibility to my department to protect what is Chamorro, but at the same time I've inherited the way things have been built, in the past, to where it is for very good reasons, economically, like the village, and sustainability. But now undoing that to get it on the right track, there's so many questions, how do we tell the vendors, or what, do we say a percentage? Do we have to say, okay, we're going to accept that these are promoting Guam, the Lati, the chiefs in stuffed toys, but is not made on Guam at all, made somewhere else, but that still represents local or represents our Chamorro-ness. So there's an area for that, and then there's an area for that it's totally made on Guam, and then some of the resources brought in but assembled and made here. So there's different categories that are that we're identifying, and so to still keep everyone happy at this point is not to say you don't fall into this or you don't belong here, but to say it's helping me define how to deal with the situation for now until we get to this. That will help carve out what those areas are as far as protecting. So I just wanted to share that, that it's real. This situation is very, very real, and that I appreciate where we're going to go with this in a hurry, if we could, because it causes a lot of conflict. It causes a question, even with people just trying to, I think there's two reasons also that people, some are artistic by knowledge and they're creative, but then it moves over to the business end, and it's questionable about whether they're pushing art or are they pushing business. And everybody needs to make a living, fine, but again, protecting the word here used as misappropriation, it's so important. So I just wanted to comment and state for the record that this is very real. There's a lot of struggle with this amongst artists that really they get offended by other people that try to replicate that are not, and they work so hard to put, with their hands and their talents and put it out, and then other people that just, buy it somewhere else and bring it and replicate it. So I'm really, really appreciating this presentation and maybe the journey we're going on with this, Senator. So I'm looking forward to how we're going to resolve, coming to the answers to these questions, because it would definitely help where we're at right now as far as the village, and even with the museum, the question of what we're going to represent in the displays and in the exhibits. So, si just maasi.
Sana ma'asi for bringing all of those points up. And you're correct, of course, that these are real issues and we really are dealing with them, and it's very murky. We have not sorted it out, and as we look at all the examples around us, there is no perfect answer. There is no situation where there is no issue that comes along with it, because these are areas where we're talking about intangible things that don't have boundaries or borders, in a solid, touchable sense, and so that maybe adds to the situation. And as you were speaking, it reminded me, in some of the research or the studying that I've done over the years, looking at Imanata Motna, so Chamorro ancestors, even in those ancestral times, gathering resources off island. So for Guahan, they would go up to Ulacas, the northernmost island, to hunt seabirds and bring them down and share all along the way. They think that maybe, I think it's the island of Agrihan that they might have gone to gather certain types of wood resources. Certainly in some of the other northern islands, the volcanic rock is very prevalent. So we just have these examples of times that even in ancestral times, they were going to different islands. We also have some circumstantial evidence that they may have been going to places as far away as the Philippines to perhaps be trading for metal at some point in their history. So it's modern situations, but we can also look at some traditional ways that it was handled that can help us maybe make sense of those questions as we move forward. And as I was doing some research between the last meeting and this one, so I've gotten a copy of Palau's copyright law, and it does talk about artistic works, so I'm looking forward to going through this. I did go ahead and at least print out a lot of the material about the Tohiwu and for the New Zealanders. And one of the things that really stuck out, and we've mentioned it before, I believe Dr. Sauter was the one who had mentioned it previously, and it's come up in other discussions, but the way that the patents and the trademark are overseen is by an advisory commission, because I think it's very important that things aren't in black and white. You can't just necessarily say one thing and it addresses every case. I think when we're dealing with real people and real indigenous knowledge and real artistic works that evolve over time and are constantly refined or meet new challenges, like needing to be recreated off island perhaps, that we need a body of experts of the various kinds to continue to address these issues on a case-by-case basis or as they continue to change. And I looked at the composition, and it's very similar composition to us, where they have various artists, they have various experts, and then they had a legal representative as part of their advisory committee, or their commission. So, Sejus Maasi for sharing all of that. It's important that we are keeping that as part of our discussion so that people understand what we are trying to really tackle and the challenges that are involved. Are there any other thoughts or discussions?
I would just like to add that, Dr. Laura's points on getting clarification on clarity in the definitions that we're going to put together as far as what is local, what is Chamorro, what is indigenous. I mean, going back to it all, that's all artist related, but what really interests me is how we're going to set up, per se, the standard operating procedures, how are we going to educate our artists so that they understand, their rights, and educate the people in understanding, we're going to be coming up with this legislation to help protect our culture, our heritage, etc. I'm actually very interested to hear what DRT's got to do now in the next presentation, and I think that's probably where my interest lays more. Kind of shy in the mic, but for the most part, I just think that that's kind of where I think I can participate a little bit more, listening to how they do it, and then maybe thinking how we can tie it all in together so that we've also had incidences where we've had artists come in and address their concerns, and believe me, sitting on this commission panel has actually opened my eyes to be more sympathetic, more compassionate, to listen to what they're saying, understanding their concerns, and sharing with them that we do want to help address these concerns and that we are working on it. And so I took this panel pretty much. I tell them we're working on this. We meet every month, and they're welcome to come and sit in to listen. And I haven't seen them show up yet, but I'll keep it going. Thank you.
Sejus Maasi for that. And later on, when we talk about what we'll be doing for next month, hopefully you'll be able to do a presentation as well about some of what's been going on for GVB. So with that, I think we've had some very good discussion. We'll turn it over to the Department of Revenue and Tax, and then we'll also, I think, be hearing more from you next month as well.
Good morning, Commission members. Good morning, Senator. I do apologize for not I did prepare the packet, but however, I was stationed at a satellite location just to make sure that everything runs smoothly. But I would assure the Commission that I would have the materials ready for you. It is detailed, and it explains the processing and everything, so that would be forthcoming on our next Commission meeting. To begin the presentation, committee members, it has been the stance since then, when it was with the Department of Commerce, to process trademark intellectual property applications. And if you were, I believe it was handed out, the application, there's two forms of applications that are presented to the applicants. One of them are the ones that have been registered with the United States Patent and Trademarks Office, which is filed similar but in different in different fashion. Whereas there is also the one which is the local Guam application. And if you, and I hope each and every one of you guys have a sample of the application. It says here, filling out and submitting application renewal for the Guam Trademark and Service Mark Guam registration. That deals strictly on a local level, and again, the filing of the application, we do have a introductory portion of the application that explains the procedure on filling out the application. When an application is submitted, I look through the application to ensure that everything is in place, meaning everything has been filed. And if not, then there is a form in the back of that application which allows me to, or the people that handles the trademark application, to one, call the applicant, ask him to complete the application, and to ensure that everything is clarified before we begin the processing or issuance of the certificate. Okay. When you look up, and I'll just go ahead and go through the steps where it says mark words and/or design. In most cases, the artist or the individual that is looking to apply for the certificate either presents a name or a logo or a style in which we go through the application and then identify the purpose of that particular design or word. Once we go through that and everything seems to be in order, they are given a 5-year renewal period. And I do submit to them the fresh application, and we do have an amended that during the period that they make changes in the design or make changes in the classification, then that's when we go ahead and we process bearing the same terms and ensuring that the changes were made, but they still pay the processing fee. There is no wavering of the fee, they still pay the fee. And again, getting back to some of the things that I had received, which it was very well put together, Dr. Sauter. A lot of the artists that do come in, they either utilize a lot of the symbols on Guam. Take, for example, the seal. The Guam seal has been used numerous times, but changing out the designs inside of that, using a lot of the local items such as the coconut, the coconut crab and stuff, and then they design it and make it their artistry, and then they want to trademark their particular logo or designs. And so with that, we ensure that that artistry or that art that has been put together is considered their design, not something that was picked up by another artist. And with that, it is, if you go to the second to the last page, which shows the declaration. On that declaration, we make sure that when they do submit that application into us, that particular design was their own creation and not copied or duplicated in any shape, form, or fashion by any other artistry. So I can see the concern in putting together what you did, Dr. Sauter, because it does create a lot of problems with, especially with Anne-Marie, your position, because I too have encountered that with a lot of the artists when they come in and they said, hey, they have copied that, and I said, well, if that's the case, then we may revoke that and not put that into effect. So a lot of the application on the Guam side has been a lot of artists that has produced some really unique artistry. But again, it's how you define it and how you see it as whether it is suitable or not suitable for use. And so that's one of the things we look into. Whereas with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, USPTO, that's already explained, that once that thing has been submitted, it is automatically given the certificate, Guam recognizing it that it is a United States Patent and Trademarks recognition or recorded certificate or intellectual property. And that is given the same term as that which was recorded with the United States Patent and Trademarks Office. So in going through those two applications, there is a difference between the two. Again, the protection lies with actually with the United States Patent and Trademarks Office. They do have their own set of protection, but with us here in Guam, it is just basically a recordal and nothing more. And so that's the fine line of what we do over at the Department of Revenue and Taxation is go through the application, ensure that the application is properly filled and that it is genuine by the applicant to ensure that before issuance of the certificate that all areas have been checked and verified that it is authentically theirs. And so that's how we go through the processing of the application. And again, I do apologize, but I will have that on our next presentation next month, and also a hard copy of how we process these certificates on both ends.
Suzuki Masi for the information. Can you remind us how much the fee is to file an application?
Okay. For the United States Patent and Trademarks Office, the fee is $50, given the same term as that is recorded with the United States Patent and Trademarks Office. And with the Guam trademarks, it's $100 for 5 years. And that fee has not changed since the inception of the program. And so that's the difference between the two, and only given 5 years.
I see. And have you known there to be any issues where people have actually used their certificate to claim that somebody has copied? And I would imagine that goes to the courts and not your office, but maybe there's a step in your office that deals with that?
Yes, Senator. There's been several. In fact, there was several that I have declined only because it's just a letter change. One of them wanted to use, let's say, half a day, but then they changed one letter, and they're using the same classification. Therefore, a letter submitted to the applicant stating that there's a percentage that indicates that it's more than deceptive to use that would endanger or hamper the first applicant from his rights to selling his tangible items. So we do have, and there's several, I believe it was during the time, during the Department of Commerce, when they had an issue, and it was at one of the big markets where we were informed of the infringement, and we were able to clarify that situation. But in all that, if this was to get into a deeper situation, then yes, it would normally be handled on a court level.
So with the infringement, it sounds like there's some time that's allowed to be put into investigation. And am I right that there are some penalty fees that the Department of Revenue Tax might be able to apply, or has that not occurred?
Senator, on that particular incident, it's basically that we go over there and inform the violator that he has infringed on that individual's trademark, as to imposing a set amount of penalties or fees. That's not really listed in our laws, or the laws that was written for the trademarks, patent, and copyright. And I think that's where the gray area for us in how we proceed to apply penalties affect us. The only thing that we know that when we were out there to inform the applicant is that if this does not cease, what we would do is inform the first applicant that he has a right to file that, and that we, as the steward of that library or the recorder, would cooperate with the courts in notifying them that we do have them and they are the first legal registrant.
That's important to hear because, of course, we're not. I mean, it's that fine line between our first goal is not to be punitive. Our first goal is to be protective, but there has to be some mechanism that does make sure that that protection's in place. So it is good to hear that you do investigate, you do inform, and then you do keep an eye on it so that if necessary, the person's whose whatever's been applied for, that they have the ability to work on that protection on their own as well. So are there any questions or thoughts?
I have several questions, actually, just for clarification. Does the Guam app that is paid to revenue and tax, do the applicants pay you the U.S. Patent fee?
No, they don't. There's
No,
a
they don't.
separate application. There's two different types of application, Doctor.
Applications.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of them is the Guam-only trademarks, and then the other one is the U.S. Patent and Trademarks Office application. So that's how I distinguish between the two. When it's with the USPTO, what they would furnish us is a certificate or an annex that says they have registered with the USPTO. But with the Guam trademark, it's totally different because there's a declaration, the second to the last page, that gives us the determination to show that, one, the applicant who had submitted the application is in fact the true and legal artist or holder of that intellectual property. And it's through that we go ahead and I do a search just to ensure that they did not take any concept or any ideas from the USPTO and create it and make it their own. So I do my research to clarify whether or not they would be granted the certificate.
So it seems that that it's like a two-step process that helps get full protection under the U.S. law. If they applied to revenue and tax, then they get validated or certified that it is authentic, and that is then used in their application to the federal
That's correct.
process. Okay, thank you. Can I continue to ask my questions? Okay. Is the same application used for intellectual copyrights? Same application?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Is there a virtual bank of all of the designs that you have reviewed?
I'm sorry.
For example, do you have a virtual bank or some place where people who are interested in creating new designs can access to determine themselves whether they have, is there a search mechanism? Because I know that, for example, when we trademarked our logo and our sort of theme, for our company, we did a search, and we were able to do a preliminary search to determine whether or not a concept that we've promoted that we want to utilize is already used, the name of a book, those kinds of things. So is there something comparable for Guam designs?
not with Guam, but what I do tell them that if they want to ensure that their copywritten material or their material that they have is not duplicated or copied, then I would always address them to the U.S. Library of Congress, and that it's true that there is their website that have all that information. But for local, no, we don't.
So-
However, I would like to see one
Yeah,
done
that might
because
be great.
yeah, it would help tremendously.
And it also, it speaks to transparency and to facilitating knowledge sharing with the artist. I understand from what you've said that the most frequent request for trademark is related to the design of logos and material to be used like on T-shirts and things like that?
That's correct.
Okay, so it doesn't include things like intangible properties at this point?
You're talking about the logo and designs, ma'am? In most of the application, a lot of the classification is usually for sporting wear, clothing, and apparels. And I'll give you one example, and I hope she doesn't mind that I use that concept or their name. But one of them got a artwork from the late Greg Flores, and I'm pretty sure you know who I'm going to refer to is Coco Joe. And the only reason why I brought that up is because if you look at the artistry that was done in that, it has a local flavor, but then she went ahead and trademarked that to ensure that that particular design is not being duplicated or copied to sell her product. And so when you look at a lot of the stuff that has been recorded, a lot of them, they do come up with a lot of very interesting artistry. And when they do that, they want to protect that. And in most cases, they always ask me, so what do I benefit out of the Guam trademark? Well, the benefit that you have with the Guam trademark is, one, it's recorded by a government agency that identifies it to be a legal recordo and a legal certificate authenticating them as the legal owner of that particular artistry. The only difference that it causes a situation with a lot of a lot of the artists out there is the fact that sometimes another artist would like to take that same concept, use it, and then that's where the problem lies. And with us not having any penalty assessment to do that, it really is an open book for everybody to say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and challenge this. And if I get caught, I get caught, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah, and this is really relevant related to symbols and related to images because, for example, the petroglyphs are used everywhere. The lati is used everywhere. Sling stones. And, I mean, that may be okay, but when we're talking about incorporating these symbols, which are ancestral, if not sacred, right? But some of them are sacred. If we are talking about incorporating those symbols into the design, what is the implication for that? How should these because we're commodifying that knowledge of our people, so we really do have to address this and decide one way or the other where we fall on this issue, because I think that even in something as harmless looking and feeling as a logo design for a T-shirt or a sports team, all of the kids are wearing designs, and they're I'm not really too well informed on sports, but when I watch the news and I watch all these little kids running around with matua. Is it matua or matao? We've discussed this in the commission. Where does this word matua come from? Because the gastautau is the root, right? So those kinds of things, and we perpetuate knowledge by way of symbolism, by way of things that people wear on their clothes and stuff like that. So I think it really requires that we be very diligent about definitions. Provide a glossary so that people know what we're talking about, and clearly, stand on a particular position so that people know. Because this fuzzy-wuzzy stuff is just, as you said, most of it is the gray area. And it just makes things difficult when there is controversy.
I think, so one of the examples or situations that come to mind right now that is related to all of this is, I'm just talking on sensitivity, I guess, and there's the gray areas, but I don't know if you remember, but it made the news and it made the social media where, there was a woman with, like Dr. Souter said, no ill intentions, just, she sat on top of a laddie and took a picture, right? And that went, viral. And just, I guess there were those that thought, oh, it's a picture. There was different perspectives on it. But I guess that's a good example of the sensitivity and how do we protect sacredness, so there's a lot of gray areas. And how do we educate on that? What's the tool that we're going to use to get the message out that these are things that I know there are classes for like the military where they have cultural sensitivity, but what is that curriculum that we can share with them that they're going to share with with the military, because they're one of our greatest visitors, right, or that come to live with us. So how do we, get the word out? How do we, and even we ourselves have a lot of gray areas, so we just need to figure it out.
Can I raise another issue? The issue is, if we consider that the use of a sacred symbol or a traditional cultural symbol is inappropriate, does that mean it's inappropriate for Chamorros as well as non-Chamorros? Because this is important. I mean, if we say the use of the petroglyphs is inappropriate, just say as an example, then that means it's inappropriate no matter who uses it, no? And yet we know, I mean, let's be real, we know that some of our Chamorro artists are going to say, no, I can use these sacred symbols, I can commodify these sacred symbols, I can commercialize these sacred symbols, but no one else can. So we also have to be true and consistent about those kinds of issues, because we want to be fair to all artists, but we also want to be diligent about protecting what is sacred and indigenous. So I think we need, just for the record, we need to also clarify that point as well.
Yeah, if I may, Senator, I agree with you, Doctor. It's always been our stance, though, with the Department of Revenue and Taxation. If we see something that desecrates or demoralizes the artistry or the symbols of what represents Guam, we always try to explain to the applicant that, really, we really don't want to proceed on with even granting the issuance of a certificate, because I think one of the things that we, at least with me, is that I want to ensure that, because it symbolizes us as a people here in Guam, that these types like the seal, the lati, the kalaidi, and all the other things that is symbolic of Guam, that it doesn't get desecrated or deformated. And so one of the things, and I know maybe I might get a challenge from it, but then that's something that I would have to face, and maybe hopefully with our legal that I get well represented. But it's something that we always try to instill in anyone that applies, to be very mindful of the type that the type of application they're submitting. And I think with this commission is if we, like the doctor says, is if we make a stance and kind of address that issue, then that's something that would go a long way in putting down as part of our guideline or standard operating procedure that these are the things that we will not adhere to or even accept. And so, so it's been that way with me when we've been starting this, is that I always try to scrutinize and look at that symbol and then try to reason or talk with the applicants that maybe you can either think up another design or come up with another art that would be well represented of your item.
It's very helpful to hear how the process is currently in place and the abilities or lack of direction, so that as we're developing this, we can have it complement or answer or address some of those issues. And as we were speaking, I was thinking one of the things that we might want to consider is that for these symbols that maybe we would say belong to the Chamorro people, like the pictographs, like the slingstone. Actually, there are many, many shapes, although we're most familiar with one type of the shape for the slingstone. But maybe there would be a requirement akin to some of what goes on for the Guam product seal, is that there needs to be a certain amount of additional, like, new elements to it. So if somebody is going to take those two very famous, probably our best known pictographs from Gadao Cave, that one person cannot claim that as their logo, because that, in a sense, either belongs to the people of Inalahan, Tautau Inalahan, or the Chamorro people as a whole might be the determination. And so that if they're going to use it in a logo or something that they're selling, such as a t-shirt design, that maybe there would have to be a certain percentage that is additional that makes it uniquely theirs, but still does not take away from somebody to be able to continue using those Gadao pictographs. And one of the examples I was thinking of with GVB, they have a good example, I think, of taking those cultural symbols but using them in a way that is new. And so I was asking about the symbol. Okay, yeah, it kind of looks like 3 smiles, and the way that it's been explained to me, I'm not sure if I'm on track, so maybe you can let me know, but that one of the arcs represents like an outrigger of a Sackman or the Sackman canoe itself, that one represents the Sanahi, and I'm not sure, do you know the third one? Okay. But they represent that each of those things that are very traditional, but they've made something new out of it. So that might be one of those types of examples where we can take very traditional things but put them together in such a way that it doesn't take away from others' ability to also refer to the Sanahi or so. And then there are a couple of examples I have of ones, and so I'm not here to say that they're right or wrong. It's just what I would do with my students is I would show them some of these examples and say, well, how do you feel about it? Because we all have to discern this at some point. And so one was a t-shirt with a laddie, but they had made a snowman out of it with a scarf and a carrot nose and coal eyes. And so again, I'm not here to say that that's correct or not, but it shows us that journey of how we can get farther and farther away from its original meaning. And perhaps it was a way to bring that cultural symbol along with someone as they're encountering new areas. But that could be the type of thing that this commission looks at and tries to evaluate. Or there's also the other one, and again, I think these are all done with good intentions, so it's not challenging anybody's intentions, but where do we as a community, where do we sit in these? And then another one was taking that pictograph from Gadao's cave, and I don't know that we've ever decided 100%, is that a coconut, is that a slingstone, what is that under his arm? But it was used as a symbol for a demining group, if I have it correct. And so for them, it was the symbol of like the bomb. And so again, that was one of the ones that really made me think. It's a non-Indigenous group, and it's something non-Indigenous. If it's a slingstone, perhaps that was warfare, and maybe we can make some connections. But just examples of the kind of areas that these questions can get into. But thank you very much for your presentation. Did we have any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so we've gone through Dr. Sauter's presentation. We've gone through the first part of Mr. Unsiag's presentation about what goes on at the Revenue and Taxation. And let's move on to the agenda item 3, old business of the agenda, which we will continue where we left off from our last meeting, discussing the formulation of the Guam Trademark Commission committees. So section 14104K of the Guam Trademark Commission Act allows the commission to establish committees and include additional public and private sector members to serve in, as it's written there, it's 4 areas of visual arts, performing arts, literary arts, and traditional arts, demonstrations and exhibitions. But we've talked about those 4 art forms, of course, being very important, but that we may want to visit setting up the committees differently. Maybe there would be one to tackle different components of the actual act itself rather than different components of the arts that it will be serving. So the first thing that I would ask us to get us ready for continuing this work is, which of the 2 policies do we want to tackle first? I'm thinking, and this is up for discussion as well, I'm thinking that we want to tackle one at a time, but I'm open to consideration of whether we want to tackle similar issues in both at the same time. What do people think? Should we select one of them? So the 2 are the Guam Trademark and Intellectual Property Rights Act is one, and then the other is the Guam Cultural Trademark Act, which is about cultural certification. So what do we think? Do we want to go forward with one at a time?
It would seem to me that if we resolved the issues related to a Chamorro cultural trademark, that then we would be better predisposed to do things more generally. So I think if usually we move from the general to the specific, but in this case, since the specific is central to our mission as a commission, I think maybe if we dealt with that first, the more general would follow more easily. I don't know. I mean, that's my thinking on this.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that we've cleared up a lot of gray areas, or at least set some definitions that we can agree upon, that might help create a very good foundation for the more general. Yeah. Do others have other thoughts that they'd like to add, or would anybody like to make a motion that we start with the Guam Cultural Trademark Act?
I make the motion that we begin our planning and further discussions on clarifying and solidifying the trademark, and really what that is, what that means, and all these questions on the last page of Dr. Sauter's presentation is pretty much where I think what we need to address to begin that path of leading to the other areas for planning.
Hungin Sujusmasi for that motion, and yes, it will tackle many, if not all of the questions that Dr. Souter raised and that we've each been bringing up here and there. And then even within
Point of
the
clarification, please.
legislation, there are 9 areas for us to tackle as well. Yes.
Point of clarification. Can I just ask you to, was the motion for the Guam trademark, or were we going to work on the cultural certification trademark program first?
The cultural certification.
Okay, thank you.
So that was the motion. Do I hear a second?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Maulik. So we have unanimous agreement that we'll move forward with that. And that's very good because that can be in the back of our minds as we move forward. And what I can do on my part is I can send some information, not that all of it needs to be read between now and then, but just for us to glance at from Palau, from New Zealand. And I did print out or download the Indian crafts and arts law as well. So I can send out those via email just for you to peruse through to see some of the ways that they've tackled things to help us think about how we might tackle this in subcommittee groups. Oh, I haven't downloaded that one, but I certainly can for Hawaii, and make sure that we all get a copy of that. And I think there's also maybe a model law that I can try and send. So again, not that everybody needs to read all of it, but so that they can skim it for ideas of how it's been tackled elsewhere and how we might want to think about our subcommittee groups that will be working on some of these issues. Dr. Souter mentioned that at our history conference presentation that we did have, I think it was at least a couple of people that asked to be on subcommittees, and you may also be thinking about others that might be helping you. I think Matt has talked about he's been able to have some of these discussions with coworkers, so maybe we have coworkers or others that are interested. Certainly we're open to receiving public input of people who might be interested in issues like this and might be able to have the time to work on a subcommittee.
And Senator, I
Yes.
took the bold step of asking the Comisión Samoro if it would serve as a subcommittee for some of these areas that relate very specifically to traditional Chamorro sacred sites, intangible properties, and the Comisión has agreed to serve as a subcommittee in that regard as well. So,
Gof Maulik, I think the more that we have that are very familiar with different aspects of this work, the more that it's going to benefit all of us. Sijusmasi.
Is the Guam Museum involved at all? The Guam Museum? I think that'll be helpful in.
Yes, definitely. We'll invite Leona to come to the table. There's also, well, she's playing so many roles, but we'll figure it out. But yes, definitely, the Guam Museum will be.
And I think, I don't know if it was the first meeting of the fully empaneled COSAS board, but I think they've met recently, but there are, so that's a good suggestion. There are experts there, and they may, as a body or as individuals, they might be good resources to tap into. Sijusmasi for the recommendation or the
Sijusmasi.
suggestion.
Yes.
And something else I'd like us to keep in mind, we've discussed it a couple of times, but we did hear back from the United Nations the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and they did say that we as a government can't pursue things, but a non-governmental agency or a non-profit organization could. So if we can continue to think about entities that we know of, so that we do have somebody actively working on this. I know Rita Nauta is often here. Guampedia might be interested. And there are different entities. I believe that they're also nonprofits. I believe the Guam Preservation Trust is. So we have several entities that are very active, have very good track records. So if we can be continuing to think about who might be serving that role for us, we can get some movement even on the international stage, and possibly get some things registered that others, such as Frank Rabone, have brought up, dances and other things, chants or songs. So if I might suggest, at the next commission meeting in December, we'll hear from Revenue and Tax, and then if you are able to provide a presentation on GVB's, would I be correct in saying it on their brand development? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we've secured that yet, but I'll try to find out the date for our next meeting. Yeah, we do have some dates that are already secured for December, and I know it's a difficult time because we have all the fall holidays. Okay, and so we'll do our best to accommodate. We'll definitely work with you, and then if you're not able to be here in December, we can schedule that for January. Yeah. So again, if we can have those in the back of our minds. So we know that we're going to be working on the Cultural Certification Trademark Program first. I will be sending out some materials for you to peruse through. We'll be starting to look for possible members for our subcommittees and to be thinking about what subcommittees make the most sense in starting to tackle this. And again, if there's an entity who might pursue this, yes.
Yeah, I believe Reverend Tax should be be a member of all the committees established. I believe Reverend Tax should be involved with all the committees.
Maulik, yes, I think that will make a lot of sense. And so what we might end up doing is having a very specific subcommittee for Rev and Tax, and then everybody can seek advice from, I mean, we'll just have to figure out how it's going to make the most sense. But being part of the commission, you will definitely be we'll all be part of each other's work in one way or the other. But especially there's an existing program. You guys have a lot of important guidance to give us. We will definitely keep that in mind. Yes.
Yeah, yes, Senator, and I agree with Albert. The only thing that I wanted to bring to the commission is the clarification, or now the possibly the implementation of imposing other fines or whatever, because it is, like I said, the way that the law was drafted, it does not give any power to the Department of Revenue and Taxation other than the processing and certifying of a trademark.
That's important to be thinking about, and that's something that we can perhaps be resolving in legislation, because in order to protect, perhaps unfortunately, it also involves providing people incentive, right, to comply. Let's see, are there any other questions or items for discussion? Now that we have no further items for discussion, can I hear a motion to adjourn?
I motion to adjourn.
And do I hear a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries to adjourn this Guam Trademark Commission meeting. I thank you all very, very much for your time. I think it was very fruitful. It is now 9:55. Sejuas Masi for your attendance and participation in today's Guam Trademark Commission meeting. Have a good rest of your day.